I believe in the United States of America as a government of the people, by the people, for the people, whose just powers are derived from the consent of the governed, a democracy in a republic, a sovereign nation of many sovereign states, a perfect union, one and inseparable, established upon those principles of freedom, equality, justice, and humanity, for which American patriots sacrificed their lives and fortunes. I therefore believe it is my duty to my country to love it, to support its Constitution, to obey its laws, to respect its flag, and to defend it against all enemies. Father, as we gather here together in this classroom, we ask that you guide our studies and lead us to understanding. We also ask that you protect the individuality of each student as they question and ponder your word in these matters. Thank you, Father, for this beautiful place of learning. We pray these words in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, welcome back to Bridge Academy. This is Ms. Krewalt, and we're going to continue on with Unit 3 in American Government. And what we're doing in Unit 3 is examining the rise of a new governing theory. And basically, this is going to take the form of what we call progressivism. And how did that come about? Where did it come from? And how did it develop? And how do we view it today? And today would be looking at today's administrative state. And I'll go over what I mean by that. Now, in Lesson 2, which we just finished, we went over comparative theories of economics, and we talked about capitalism, socialism, and the utopia of communism. Progressivism is going to fall somewhere in between socialism and capitalism. And it's going to manifest itself in what I'm going to go over as today's administrative state. And I'm going to end with the story that doesn't necessarily occur in the United States, but we are viewing it in the United States as a progression of socialism in the UK, in Britain. And that's the story of Alfie Evans. Okay, what is progressivism and where did it come from? Basically, in around 1890 to the 1920s, there was a social movement that rose up, and its effort was to correct the ills of industrialization. Now, you had a massive migration of people from individual farms where they were working into the urban areas, into these new factories that industrialization had created through, the mechanization of a lot of industries. And so, you have a massive influx, you have a lot of people in one small place, and then you have a rise of this condition where so many people are working like in a new environment. This was a totally new condition in society as a result of a free market basically on steroids because of the freedom we had to invent and to promote new innovations and products, and the mechanization of certain industries just took off like a rocket. And so there was just this massive, development of not only prosperity, but on the same side, there were conditions that were new to deal with, like pollution, like child labor, working hours, because you went from a very independent state of working for a farm, working in an agricultural effort that was basically geographically diversified. So you don't have a lot of people concentrated in one area, but what industrialization showed was now we've got all of this focus on these specific centralized areas of industrialization. And of course, negative impacts of that come out, and the social movement is trying to correct some of these ills. Pollution was a new condition. I mean, we didn't have so much focus on air quality before because there was no reason to have that kind of focus. There wasn't this massive industrial effort all concentrated in one area. And obviously, the air quality was affecting the health of the people in that urbanized area. And legitimately, it became a concern that was adopted by this rising social movement. Now, what happens is it starts to turn into a political movement, and it all kind of begins with Theodore Roosevelt and really takes hold and grows roots with the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Progressivism can be defined as a political ideology that wants to address the problems facing society, such as poverty, violence, racism. And progressivism contends that government is really the best tool for making a change in these areas. And by providing good education and ensuring a secure and safe workplace, that these problems will be addressed and will be solved. And typically, it's very effective for progressives to start fueling class warfare, because what you're doing is you're drumming up support from the people that are suffering from these societal ills. And if you get their support, you've got political support to now make new laws to reverse these problems. And if you take a look at some of the images that are put forward, it's a very effective tool. I mean, look at this photograph of the children barefoot standing on this, it looks like a weaving machine. There were horrendous injuries and accidents and deaths that resulted from humans interacting with this new machinery. And also, you have just a plethora of ways to deliver that message. I mean, obviously, the written form, but now with photography, not only you get the words, but you get a picture with the words, an image that you can associate with these social ills. And these aren't just, artistic renderings, drawings of these conditions. They're actual photographs of real people. And they resonated with the public. And along with, some really good rhetoric, you can really get the people riled up. You can get active support because it touches on their emotional response to the problem. Okay, let's just name a couple of political players that kind of started out this progressive movement. Theodore Roosevelt. Now, he came from a very prominent, wealthy family. He attended Harvard, and he was a big proponent of corporations, these strong industrial businesses that now started to have a lot of political power as well as financial power. But Roosevelt came from the angle that it was time to come in and start culling back these corporations, these big industries, and reduce their power by busting up trusts. And this is the topic that Burton Folsom picks up in his book, The Myth of the Robber Barons. Now, Theodore Roosevelt started out on the Republican ticket. He was the vice presidential candidate that ran with William McKinley for president. And of course, that ticket won, but McKinley was assassinated. And so he ended up taking over the presidency in 1901. And his policies start this aggressive action toward preventing corporate monopolies. And so he brought several lawsuits, federal government lawsuits, 44 of them against these corporations. So he's using the judicial system to punish the free market, but it's going to also evolve into more regulatory power that's going to come out of the executive branch. And these are the type of progressive views that Roosevelt is injecting into the role of the presidency. Now, jump to 1913, and you have Woodrow Wilson coming in with 2 terms in the presidency. And he's coming from a long academic history in law and political science. But the colleges that he attended had adopted that German political philosophy of Marx and Engels. Okay, that philosophy is what propelled the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and they ended up with communism over there. So he's kind of coming from this mindset that has drifted over from Germany into our higher education, into our colleges and universities. And he was also able to take advantage of a deep divide in the Republican Party. I put on their GOP, and I don't know if I've mentioned it before, but GOP stands for Grand Old Party, which is basically a nickname for the Republican Party. But he's able to take advantage of a lot of divide there and draw votes in from the Republican Party. He also has to face issues on a global scale. We have the emergence of World War I in Europe, and he had to respond to that. And his means of responding to that took the form of the League of Nations, which becomes the first recognized global level governing body. This is kind of coming on the scene for the first time. We now have a world government. Now, there's some limitations, extreme limitations to the power that this government now has. But eventually, what you're going to see is a threat to the sovereignty of individual nations at the hands of this new world government. Okay, next slide. We're going to talk about the development and the rise of what I called in the introduction, the administrative state. And what I mean by administrative state is the federal government's power to use the executive department to administer laws and regulations that are legally binding on the people. Now, the role of the executive branch is to enforce the laws of Congress. But what starts to happen is that they're taking over more, they're able to secure more of this legally binding action by taking the legislative work of the Congress and now interpreting what that legislation is and developing a rule to enforce it. Now, that seems all perfectly legitimate because if you're going to enforce something, you need to develop a way to do that. I mean, what's going to be the penalty for a violation of these new laws? Well, this just evolves into this massive power grab. And I put on here the death of the separation of powers because what you start to see, and it's very subtle at the very beginning because this is a new power that's going to start to be absorbed by the executive department in a very subtle manner. They have taken Article 1, Section 1, the legislative authority of Congress, and Congress is allowing them to do this. That's what's very important. If they had started out by restricting this power in the executive department, we wouldn't have had this problem. It would never have developed to the point at which it is today. But regardless of the fact, it's the death of the separation of powers because now you have unelected bureaucrats appointed by the president. Okay, he has amassed today this immense spectrum of cabinet departments that, just have employed thousands of people. And they're all there to interpret this legislation and determine what penalties are going to be brought on the people for violating them. Now, what's unconstitutional about the whole thing is that these people are not elected, so they are intangible, they're untouchable, and they're hidden from view. Now, the heads of these departments and cabinet positions may be under public scrutiny because they're having to be confirmed in the U.S. Senate But that doesn't show the massive amounts of support personnel that are under these cabinet positions. Okay, so constitutionally, let's just visit this a little bit. What are they violating? Article 1, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution is the legislative vesting clause, which basically says all legislative powers are held by the U.S. Congress. But with this progressive movement, what you're seeing is a political power grab using Article 2, Section 2, which is the president's ability to appoint officers into his executive branch to conduct all of this business of law enforcement. Now, I'm going to read the pertinent words from Section 2 of Article 2 so that you can kind of hear what the language is regarding this subject. The President may require the opinion in writing of the principal officers of each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their offices. And that basically is the President's ability to hire advisors to assist him with his duties in office. And it goes on further. He shall have power to nominate and by and with advice and consent of the Senate. Okay, here's the Senate confirmations coming in. He shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges to the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for. Okay, there has been no mention of what these appointment names are anywhere in the Constitution. In other words, they're leaving it open for these new advisors to come into the president. And continuing on, and which shall be established by law. But the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the president alone, in the courts of law, and the heads of departments. Now, what's important here is that you see that Congress has now entered into some degree of responsibility here. But what's being interpreted, and what I see is being interpreted, is that Congress is putting the power in these appointments into the hands of the president or the court system or just the heads of departments. And so it's like they're kind of thrusting their power to appoint all of these ministers, in other words, the government employees underneath these departments or in the courts or in the president's cabinet. They're putting that power into different branches. So this is where the abuse and the power grab is like kind of got its green light. They're saying, hey, it's right there in the Constitution. We can start hiring people and, Congress has given us this power to do this. Well, the important thing to remember is you got to go look and find out where did Congress and when did Congress give them the ability to do this specific appointment of these employees, and how and what are the conditions around that appointment. Congress was supposed to be responsible for an oversight of these appointments. So that's where, Congress dropped the ball. Absolutely has dropped the ball, got lazy, and allowed these unelected bureaucrats to just run amok in all these different branches. And there is very little oversight going on, and there is no correction going on to kind of cull back this leviathan of government officials that have the power to bind you under law to respond to and to abide by regulations. Okay, so how this starts to manifest itself is during the Great Depression. You have a lot of people who are very discouraged. And so it's very easy to garner that emotional power from people who are suffering economically and to start really driving that wedge of class warfare. Okay, it's a very, very effective means to drum up support for some kind of action to respond to the problem of the day. So what Franklin Delano Roosevelt does is he responds to this by creating all of these new departments. And there's just a mass of them that get started during this New Deal of President Roosevelt. One of them, just as an example over here on the right, that the NRA, that is not the National Riflery Association, okay? Don't get those confused, okay? That's a private organization. The NRA that was created by the New Deal was the National Recovery Administration. Okay, this is where you get the alphabet soup of agencies in the government. The NRA gave authority to the president to initiate industry-wide codes. Okay, these are binding laws because they're regulations that are legally binding in these industries. So industry-wide codes intended to eliminate unfair trade practices, which that agency is going to be the one that determines what's unfair. And reduce unemployment. Okay, I don't know how a government agency is supposed to reduce unemployment, but that is their role. Do you see how broad spectrum that is? Establish minimum wages. Now we're going to get into price controls. And maximum hours. Okay, we're getting into labor laws. How long can you require someone to work? And guarantee the right of labor to bargain collectively. Okay, you remember this when we talked about labor unions and their collective bargaining. So power is given to the labor unions, the heads of the labor unions, and this is not all of the workers on a whole. They're represented by heads of a labor union. They're allowed to bargain as a collective unit against or with the owner of that corporation. Okay, so you can see with this agency, just this one right here and the way it's described, you can see where the ideology is to go in to the workforce and respond to the demands of the common man. Now that seems all fair and good. You know, you want the people to have power to, make effective change in their government. The reason why this becomes a power grab and a centralization of power is because these agencies are able to go in and without the advice or consent of Congress, make new laws that are governed over us. And they just really operate in the dark. We have no constitutional authority over these employees that are effectively legislating. They have assumed this Article 1, Section 1 vesting power of legislation. And that is where the violation comes in. Okay, let's get into some of the cultural and social efforts that drive this appointment of power. What's going on at the same time period, and you know this from your own U.S. history class, the Russian Revolution is developing in Russia at this time and is spearheaded by the Bolsheviks, who are kind of giving merit to this communism, this communist ideology that was brought up by Karl Marx. And you can't be thinking about this in retrospect. You have to be considering the fact that what the world is witnessing in Russia is the working man being empowered, okay, by the Bolsheviks' aggressive, basically coup of the government. It looks very democratic on the surface, but obviously your history of the Russian Revolution is going to show you that it is absolutely devastating to the Russian people. So at the time, it's gaining immense popularity, and it's all based on this class warfare fuel. Kind of like the French Revolution, they're just injecting this hatred between the classes. So you're able to take the working man and say, look what the wealthy man did to the working man. Now, a lot of this political movement is being generated by the old suffragettes and the abolitionists. They were so effective in look at what happened. You have an entire civil war that occurred to reverse slavery, and you have the women's suffrage movement successful in gaining their right to vote. And these were all good things for the nation. I mean, these were all positive improvements that were made on a political level. But what's happening is now they've got their game plan down, and so the women's suffrage movement turns into what you see today as the women's rights movement. And abolitionism gives way to the civil rights movement. They're kind of going to go their separate ways and build off this social capital that they've created. They've got a political game plan that works. It's proven now. And they're going to continue to develop that political power. All right, now remember in the previous lecture I talked about these blood brothers being government and economics. And they are blood brothers because power and money just go hand in hand. Okay, money is power. And the powerful use their money to retain and grow their power. So if you've got political power now's the time to come in and grow that power. And you get the 16th Amendment. And what do you remember about the 16th Amendment? That's the income tax. Okay, that's where the government now has the privilege to demand money from you based on how much income you make. And being that it is a now constitutional law, you are under the rule of law. You are bound to pay that income tax if it is demanded of you by the government. So now you have a massive vat of money that just married power. I mean, Katie, bar the door. There's no protection now. And now that the means is firmly established to manipulate the power, the next thing to do is to knock off the opposition. So that's what this 17th Amendment was designed to do, and it does it very effectively. The 17th Amendment reads that the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state. Okay, we already know that. But now they're to be elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. This overrides Article 2 that reads, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof, for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. What the 17th Amendment was designed to do was to strip out state power, and they achieved that this way. It seems like they're trying to hand power back to the people so that senators can be elected at large. But this doesn't really help the people very much. It more so strips power away from the state governments because the legislature has power in the state and the people have direct access to that legislature. So there's a very short line there between the people and the power. And they are the ones appointing 2 senators, which are supposed to uphold the state's interest. The state's interest, not the people's. That's what the House of Representatives is for. That's where all of the power, all of the funding power, all of the direct access for a constituent of a state to have access to the federal government, that's what the House is for. The Senate was supposed to maintain state sovereignty. Okay, that was supposed to help them remain independent, be able to act alone when it was constitutionally legitimate to do so. Okay, that got completely destroyed with the 17th Amendment. In the 18th Amendment, is the Prohibition Amendment. After 1 year of ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or exportation thereof from the United States to all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. Okay, basically they're saying you cannot sell alcohol. You can't make it, you can't transport it, you can't sell it anywhere. And this is basically kind of throwback to that original idea. The progressivism movement was trying to cure the social ills through government means and government mandate. And that's exactly what they're doing here. They're saying, hey, alcoholism destroys lives, destroys people's jobs, it destroys families, and we're just going to make it a law that you cannot buy alcohol. And of course, that eventually was repealed by the 21st Amendment. But again, government actions that try to cure social ills. All right, there's a litany of progressive action over the years, but first what I want to do is I think you need to take a break. I'm going to take a break, and we'll come back and finish this slide, which basically we're going to touch on what kind of modern day progressivism looks like, and then we're going to get in and examine what that hierarchy looks like in government now and how that changed what the structure of our U.S. government became. All right, y'all take a break, and we will bring this back up on the flip side. All right, welcome back from the break. I hope you had a good break. I ended up going boating, but before I went boating, my son decided to slice his leg open on the edge of the boat. So before I got to go boating with my boys, we had to go to the emergency room, and I got a very good lesson in how progressivism has destroyed American healthcare. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But for right now, let's return to that slide that we were talking about, the rise of the administrative state. And let's talk about what happens after the New Deal. Basically, all of these agencies that were created kind of busted open the floodgates for an unlimited amount of opportunity for the government to start absorbing these responsibilities and converting them into some kind of remedy for the American people. Remember that for progressives, the remedy for any problem in society is a government program. You got to create some kind of regulation, then some penalties for violating those regulations, and of course some benefit that the taxpayer has to take on in order to remedy this problem or create some kind of reparations for it. And I'm taking a big leap here because I'm jumping from 1919 and to today, which is, 2018. We're talking about 100 years of progressive action. So, I can't possibly cover everything that happens throughout there. Every time there was a problem. Okay, so unemployment. Everyone that is unemployed, maybe their skills need to be developed. So then they create a new program that retrains employees so that they can come back into the workforce. Well, that becomes a government project. You got to take the taxpayers' money, funnel it into some kind of program that you can offer to the people, and then you've got to filter it down through the from the federal government down through the state and into the county so you can actually get this service to the people. All of that cost immense amounts of money to transfer all this information down so that you can provide a training program for the unemployed. And of course, the premise, the reason why this must happen, according to the federal government and progressives, is because these people who are unemployed have no other option, that the government is the savior in this situation and is going to, lift them out of their unemployed situation and deliver them into a new job with this new training. Okay, let's talk about global warming or environmentalism. Someone has determined that we are destroying our natural world. A scientist of some rapport has decided that he's going to do a study, write a paper, and deliver a speech about this impending doom on the entire world if we do not take care of an environmental problem that he is determined does exist. And remember, this is a social ill because it's going to affect everyone. You start off by promoting this rhetoric, getting another scientist to come in, having conferences, having Earth Day, giving examples of how we are destroying the earth, putting it out there, getting support from an administration that is agreeing with this rhetoric. Okay, now we got to fix it. So let's develop a new agency called the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And what does it take to do that? Well, you need a facility down in Washington. You need a building. And you need to develop some kind of program. What is this government program going to look like? Well, you got to bring information. You need to hire all these scientists and attorneys to determine what's going on here and how we're going to address it. Well, you're going to do a big study. That's going to cost you a lot of money. Then they're all going to sit down and determine, okay, we are doing this amount of damage to our earth. Now that we have violations occurring and that we're identifying them, we need to start putting regulations in to deter people from committing these violations against our environment. Then you need someone to decide, what is the violation? How do we put words to this term that we're saying is a violation? You need to hire some lawyers, some writers, some studiers, and some scientists to all gather together and say, okay, if you are doing this on your farm, you are destroying the environment around your farm. Now, how is the farmer going to know that he's violating some kind of EPA rule? Well, he's going to get a visit from someone they hired to go inspect the farm. Then he's going to be delivered a penalty for his violation. Now the farmer's got to pay a violation, or he needs to change something on his farm so that he is not doing what he is currently doing. This will incur costs, not only for paying for the violation, but making the change to the farm so that he is no longer committing a violation against the federal government's regulation. What if he can't afford to make this change? Now you're entering into a negotiation with a federal agent about what has happened here. You're basically on trial. Now, you may come out on top in this situation, or you may not. Then you've got to determine, how do I fold in all of these changes I now have to make because of a regulation into my cost structure for my agricultural business? So not only are the taxpayers paying to fund the EPA to do all of these functions, but the farmer is now incurring expenses to repair what the EPA has determined is a violation on his farm. No one's talking about all of the expenses that are being paid. All they see is a government building in DC that says EPA. And they think, great, someone's there to protect us from destroying our world. The EPA and this one violation against one farmer on one farm is just one example of one federal agency that is imposing one regulation. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any industry in America that is not financially affected by government regulation. I just put it to you right there. Go for it. Try to find one. Try to find one endeavor that you would like to pursue that wouldn't involve bumping into federal, state, county, or city bureaucrats. Just go for it. Please send me your emails. Give me one. I would love to see it. Progressivism siphons off the oxygen of a free market economy and basically destroys it. And what we have in its place is a function called the administrative state. Nobody does anything without getting permission from some government official. It's as if we just don't know how to get up in the morning and step one foot into the door of our place of employment, or do anything for that matter, without getting some kind of instruction from Daddy on how to do everything. Now, one thing I want to make clear, I am not saying that there aren't some good government oversights that provide services for this nation that are definitely worth their weight in gold. What I'm saying is that over 100 years, with this floodgates being opened by the New Deal, we are suffering from a massive, bloated government. There are just way too many bureaucrats out there working, and it's not just paying for their salaries. It is the financial implications that occur when someone says, you are doing something wrong, I'm from the government, and I'm here to fix it. That costs you money, and it may even cost you your livelihood. Now, there's a term here on the side of the slide, and it says red tape. Red tape is excessive bureaucracy or adherence to rules and formalities, especially in public business. So when someone says, man, I'm trying to get such and such done, but there's just so much red tape involved. Well, it means, like, let's say you are trying to go down to the Department of Motor Vehicles and get your driver's license. You just can't walk up there and just say, hey, I'm ready to take my test. I've studied, I've practiced, and, just please put me in a car, examine my driving, and I'll go home with the driver's license. No, it doesn't work like that. The government is not going to make it that easy for you to get a driver's license. You know that you've got to come up with like an encyclopedia of documents proving that you now know how to drive. All of those little errands and papers and forms and documents that you have to either work for, pick up, apply for, fill out, all of that, that's what they're calling the red tape. It's just like it's excessive. Like just the amount of man hours involved for a new driver to get a license to drive is just extraordinary. And what they're calling this is that effort and all those papers and documents, that's the red tape. During the Obama administration, there was a massive push to start hiring government agents to come in and further regulate us. And you need to read this article that basically delineates how these regulations are costing us over $100 billion a year, either in our jobs or fines or payment of some government official to do something. It just compounds on itself. And this is costing the taxpayer more money than he can afford. We are $20 trillion in debt. And congressional members just to continue to spend like drunken Marxists. There is no end. There is no maximum. There is no budget that they need to deal with. They just continue, just whatever it is that needs to happen, okay, put it down on the bill. The taxpayer will pay it eventually. Just think of it as if your parents went out every weekend, took their credit card that had no limit on it, and bought a yacht every weekend. We're just going to buy a yacht. I want a different one. I want a whole collection of yachts just because I want them and because somebody else is paying the bill, so it doesn't really matter to me. That is what government agencies are doing to you right now. This is your future tax dollars they are spending today. And don't forget, when you put something on a credit card, there's interest to be paid. That also accrues at a very high rate. Okay, so in politics, you don't hear the Progressive Party is having an election and we're going to vote for progressive. It doesn't fall under that name. What you need to understand that progressivism is an ideology. And it is an ideology that gets adopted by candidates that are running for office. And they're in other words, they're espousing this ideology when they go out and they make a speech. Well, it's not just one party. Today, we pretty much have every party espousing these types of ideas because what has happened is that on a cultural level, on a social level, we have become immune to this progressive action. It just becomes part of the everyday occurrence. And so people just learn to accept it. You have been groomed to accept that this is the way it's going to be. So unless you stop thinking that way, it will never change. Okay, we do have some self-proclaimed progressives. And Hillary Clinton in 2007 pretty much, decided and declared herself a progressive when she was running for president the first time. So it's a lot of these ideas are going to filter down through the Democratic Party. But, you've still got people from the Green Party, people from the Republican Party that are adopting these ideologies and this method of operation. And they're just deciding that it's just here to stay. But I put the challenge to you to start rethinking what it is we actually need the government to take care of. And it should be at the most minimum level possible. Because we've trended to a more mixed economy, a more socialized economy, and socialism only lasts as long as the taxpayers continue to fund it. Socialism looks great on paper until you run out of everybody's money. Then it looks like Venezuela does today. The way you can correct this, because this is not how we set up America. The original Constitution did not set up a massive, bloated government. It set up limited government because governments take away freedoms. They do not grant you freedoms. You know that. Your creator granted your freedoms. Government has a very bad habit of taking those freedoms away. And they're going to do it. But you must stop them. You must listen to what they're saying. What is their proposal? When someone runs for office and they're making a speech, listen to what they're saying. Is government action going to be their solution to a problem in their community? Or have they looked for a private sector resolution instead? And on top of that, is there a rhetoric being given that says, you know what, you have this problem because you created it, and therefore it is not the government's, it is not the people's, it is not the taxpayers' responsibility to fix it. It's that person's responsibility to fix that problem because maybe they created it on their own. Okay, let's look at a diagram that reflects this type of growth in government. You're looking at a diagram of the federal government of the United States. You can see there, very properly displayed, at the very top of all of these branches is the Constitution, and that is exactly where it belongs. Okay, under the Constitution comes the three branches of government. You have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Now, this diagram is only showing how the executive branch is further growing underneath this dotted line. Above the dotted line, you pretty much have what's written in the Constitution. The president, the vice president, and his officers below him. Once you hit that dotted line, these people are neither elected nor are they confirmed by the Senate. These are just department headings. You go and look at the staff underneath these department headings, and I think you would be shocked. This structure is the reason why you can't get up in the morning without bumping into a government bureaucrat. Do you consider this limited government? Do you consider this a good reflection of what the Constitution created as our form of government? How is this structure different from what you read in the Constitution? Now, when you go to work today, if you work for a private enterprise, you tell me how this structure compares to a private enterprise structure. Do you think that a manager could afford to hire all these people to do their job? No private enterprise could set up a structure like this and survive a year. They just could never afford to do that and make a profit. Now consider the fact that everything below that dotted line, every person working in those departments are unelected. They are making decisions that are legally binding on you and everything you do in your day, but you cannot go to the polls and vote them out of office. They will never be on that ballot. Now, do we have a government of we the people, or do we have a government of we the government bureaucrats? Over 240 years ago, Thomas Jefferson included this grievance in the Declaration of Independence. Remember that this Declaration of Independence is addressed to King George III. So when I say he, I'm referring to the king. Quote, "He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass people." A multitude of new offices. Well, what do you think that looks like on your screen right now? And sent hither swarms of officers. How many people do you think are employed in all those offices you see on your screen? To harass our people. Just think about the farmer. The day before the government official arrived on his farm, he got up and he went to work and he produced something. But the day the government official arrived, he had to stop all of his production to engage with this government official. And it didn't stop there. It probably became a very lengthy process of satisfying what demands this government official was making of him. It cost him time. It cost him money. And it cost him lost revenue because now he's not doing anything to produce a product that will gain him an income. He's going to be working for the government, and there will be no return on that work. So not only is the farmer now not able to produce an income for that day, but he and you paid a government official to come to the property and to conduct this government business. So therefore, you did not earn what you were supposed to earn today at your place of employment. In a progressive's mind, this is legitimate governing. This is all justified in an effort to protect the people. So you need to decide, is this the kind of protection you want to pay for? This is the U.S. debt clock. And basically, it's a website, usdebtclock.org, that is visually recording in real time how much debt our nation is going into. I'm not talking about private debt. I'm talking about public debt. How much money the government is spending that is not being paid for now. It is a loan. In other words, we took out a loan for this amount. This amount right here in the corner. That's how much loan debt we have today. And see, you can see it just changes constantly. It's constantly going up. So we're at over $21 trillion in debt now. This is debt per citizen. Okay, so everybody in your family, from your baby brother to your 84-year-old grandmother, okay? Did you ask them today? Can you ask them today for $64,600? Because that's what we need to get out of debt. If you divide all the number of taxpayers into this 21 trillion, every taxpayer would have to pay $174,000 for our nation to get out of debt. You know, do you have that much in savings? And can you afford to hand over $174,000? Now, I know that image is like a little disconcerting, you know, and almost unbelievable, but this is the reality we are dealing with right now. Our government structure has overtaken our ability to manage it. We can't control the spending, and we can't control the power. So I'm using this as an example to show you that this is how the power grab works. And I told you originally, money and power go hand in hand. That's why government and economics are blood brothers. Because if you don't set up a system that's going to limit the amount of power your government has, they are going to keep accumulating it and the money that increases their power until you stop them. It's a natural progression of unchecked government, and it happens in every corner of the world. Now remember, you are the employer of the government. The government is an employee of you, the citizen. That's how it's set up in our Constitution. That's how the founders set up the United States government, the federal government. And although it may appear like the government has become so strong that you can't put it back in check again, you're wrong. We have put in checks and balances in this system, but if we don't utilize them, then it will never come back into balance. All right, we're going to have 3 parts to this lecture because this is important. It's important to me to convey this information to you. And it's important that you understand what is happening with the government that was set up under this Constitution. So, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to finish up this lecture with Part C. All right, let's get back into this lecture on progressivism and the administrative state and touch on this last subject, which is the powers and checks and balances that are not necessarily named in the Constitution per se, but these concepts are derived from the Constitution the way it was written. So they may have referred to these concepts in the Federalist Papers, but they're not, it doesn't go in there. And as you recall, it doesn't say those things as words in the Constitution. These are concepts that are derived the way they constructed our government. Okay, so you have this diagram here that shows the three branches and how they are all interconnected. They have their own separate station, but there are links between them, and those links are checks and balances. They're checking to make sure the other one's, not getting too powerful, and they're trying to keep a balance of power between all three of them so that the people are not overpowered by the government, because you need these checks, and the responsibility of each branch is to make sure the other ones don't get out of control. So when they're failing to do this, like the Congress has demonstrated during this progressive movement of 100 years, you can see how the executive branch has gotten way out of control. And that's why we have this administrative state that we're speaking of. And the courts did nothing to protect the people with this progressive movement. Just like we talked about with the Dred Scott case, there was a bad decision made. And especially recently, there have been a lot of state lawsuits brought to the Supreme Court, but they have not replied in a constitutional manner. What they're doing is absorbing legislative power by almost coming through and redefining what was said so that it fits into the government agenda. Okay, let's just go through this first one. Separation of powers. You're vesting specific and different powers to separate governing bodies, specifically legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the U.S. government. So, and you know this from the vesting clause of each one of the first three articles. So they're getting separate but different powers. Congress can legislate or create laws. The executive branch, the president, is supposed to enforce those laws, and the courts need to provide an oversight of interpreting the laws that are created to ensure that they are constitutional. Okay? Those are separate powers. And each one of them is different. So the other branch can't claim those powers. And the reason why they can't claim those powers is because the Constitution expressly gives those powers to each branch. It's written that way. Now, the flip side of expressed powers or written powers is implied powers. And again, this is a term that is not spoken of in the Constitution. The way it's addressed is in Article 1, Section 8, when it says, to exercise legislative power in all cases whatsoever, and it continues on to say, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper to carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or any department or officer thereof. And this is called the necessary and proper clause, which means that you have that Congress or government has the authority to use the means to execute or legislate or judge laws. Anything additional they might need to do that, they have the authority to do that, but only with respect to laws that are necessary and proper. The necessary and proper clause does get abused quite often because it kind of opened the door for interpretation of how all of these powers are going to be executed. I mean, there has to be a certain degree of fluidity with which these branches can do the jobs that they need to do. But if you're going to go in and abuse that power, you're leaving the bounds of the Constitution. And I believe a good example of this is the creation of independent government agencies. Agencies that are outside the bounds of the government checks and balances and are able to operate freely, but are providing government services at the same time and have some degree of regulatory power over the people. And a good example of this is the Federal Reserve Bank. They have an extraordinary influence on our monetary system, but they do have, other than a light degree of congressional oversight, they're basically free to act as they see fit. The executive branch and all those departments under there are taking too much leverage with the constitutional law. The failure here is the absence of checks and balances, and that is this third term. A counterbalanced influence that regulates and restricts the powers of each branch to prevent the centralization of political power. If one of these branches starts to grow too big and too powerful, it is the responsibility of the other two branches to rein it back into place. The Constitution gives them specific powers, again, expressed powers, to check the other two branches. So, for instance, the courts can declare the president's acts as unconstitutional. But if they start to get out of bounds with this power, they know that the president has the power to appoint those judges. They can go in and declare that Congress has made laws that are unconstitutional. But they've got to understand on a human level that the Senate has the right to confirm these federal judges. So if they start to see these judges getting out of bounds, the Congress simply is supposed to execute this check by not confirming new judges that are going to be inclined to do this, or to impeach them, because they can do that as well. And the relationship between the legislative and executive branch is basically Congress makes laws, the president can veto those laws, and that's a check right there, which is pretty strong because the president has that bully pulpit. And when he says, no, I believe what you have done is wrong, and he puts a veto on there, that's a pretty strong check on the Congress. Now, Congress also has the ability to override that veto, but they've got to have 2/3 vote to do that. And they do have impeachment power of the president. So they do have the ability to do that, but, like I say, these things are difficult to achieve. That's why it's so important that you do the best job you can to put the right people in these positions, because you want them to, first of all, do them well. And if they don't do them well, you want the people in there that are going to actually provide the check and the balance to throw out the ones that are not acting constitutionally. This progressive movement that has basically created a legislative ability in the executive branch that needs to be called back, that needs to be checked. The Congress is getting very lazy. It's not doing its job to strip that power back away from the executive branch and keep it into the legislative branch. And the judicial branch has also felt this heavy influence of the progressive movement. Some judges in there have taken liberties that do not belong to them constitutionally. A good example of this is Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, the Health Care Act. It was brought as a lawsuit against the federal government by the states. That was heard in the Supreme Court. And the decision was that Obamacare was legal. And the reason they explained that it was legal was that Congress was allowed to tax individuals. And Obamacare and the penalty for not getting insurance could be viewed as a tax. Now, the whole problem with this decision was that during the deliberations, during the hearings, it was made very clear that the penalty for not buying insurance was not a tax. They made that very clear. That is how Congress wrote the legislation. But the courts came in and said, yeah, it's okay. We're going to consider it a tax. Okay, the courts can't do that. Basically, what they did was re-legislate the law. And they said, no, I know you said it wasn't a tax, but we're going to say that it is a tax, and therefore it is legal. That appears to be totally out of context with the powers of the judicial branch. As well, omission to check can be a failure of this branch as well. With the immigration battle going on as we have today, there have been certain cities, localities that have decided they are going to become sanctuary cities for illegal immigrants. So people that have come to America and they don't have papers, they didn't have permission to come here, they crossed the border illegally, are at risk for being identified and returned back to their country in an effort to comply with current immigration law. There have been localities that are claiming to be sanctuaries for these illegal immigrants. Basically, they're harboring fugitives. If you're not going to check a state or a locality that is committing this type of violation against current law, then you're failing to abide by the Constitution because you're not doing your job. Okay, separation of powers, expressed and implied powers, and checks and balances. All manifestations of the words in the Constitution. Okay, the last thing I want to discuss here is the overall picture of where 100 years of progressive policies have brought us. And when I look at the current situation, this is what I see. We have a federal government that has amassed to it so many employees that are not accountable to the public. They don't fall under the checks and balances system that was set up in our Constitution. The reason why it's effective to have people elected in a constitutional republic is because when their term's up, it's time to go. And unless they can convince their constituents that they're doing a good job and they need to stay there. So if you have a bunch of unelected government officials that have no oversight, what incentive do they have to, one, serve the Constitution, and two, serve the people? And when this is allowed to happen over an entire century, it becomes a cultural expectation. You have generations growing up expecting this type of behavior from their government. And that tends to trickle down into the private sector. Because when you have so many government regulations overseeing so many different markets and industries, it just becomes part of their culture too. And so you have things like human resource managers popping up all over the place and being a huge part of a corporate structure. So there's an entire sector of a corporation devoted to the maintenance, the enforcement, and the protection of special interest in their own private corporation. You see this in their corporate business structure as well, the way they manage. You have management that mimics the power that the federal government exerts. They start adopting these multiple levels of management. They fail to fire poorly acting employees because they're so fearful of the human resources investigations that might hurt their business. Instead, they just move weak or destructive individuals around so that they're not, they're going to get them out of somebody else's office and put them somewhere else. They don't want to fire them. Okay, they live in fear of the lawsuit constantly. Insurance markets. They have so much lobbying power in their state, in their local, in their federal governments that they basically come in and are securing market controls. They're codifying, they're making laws that have that much influence that those governments are making laws to serve those insurance markets. Those are price controls. Okay? So when you get the corporations involved in lobbying this heavily, they make laws that force you to pay certain prices instead of you acting in a free market and paying for what you can afford or what the best competitive price is. That no longer exists. You have completely destroyed the free market for insurance. What you've created is a bunch of price controls that have been set by lobbying interest for insurance markets. This has destroyed medicine. It has destroyed the American healthcare system. Today's physicians have basically become indentured servants of the government. There is so much government intervention in the healthcare system that physicians cannot operate in the free market. The only way they're going to operate in the free market is if they refuse to take insurance and if they refuse to take any government-sponsored insurance like Medicaid, Medicare, and CHIP, which is the child's health insurance plans. And they handed the power of enforcement over to the IRS, which has to be the most feared agency in the federal government because the IRS can destroy you financially. They can leave you absolutely penniless if they choose to, if they decide that you have somehow not complied with their demands. The Health and Human Services Agency has basically written just novels of regulations, rules, and created penalties to enforce them. And the enforcer, the knee breaker, is the IRS. And as a result of this legislation, the ACA, Obamacare, what has happened as you have completely withdrawn the patient from the economic exchange of money for healthcare services. You've taken it out of their hands. Okay? For some people, they're like, hey, whatever, I don't have to worry about it. Just show up to the doctor. Yeah, whatever. You know what? That is not going to work in your favor. I guarantee you. Because look at what it's created. Now, the negotiation for prices has just become an exchange between insurance companies and hospitals and doctors. So doctors are sitting there saying, okay, fine, it takes $200 for me to do stitches on this laceration that you have on your leg. But what the health insurance company is going to say is, no, I don't want to pay that. So they're putting pressure on the doctors to provide the service for less money. Okay? Now that typically is just a standard business negotiation. But it has been corrupted. Because what has happened is patients are forced to buy insurance. And the insurance is being forced to provide certain services. This is all because of the law. Okay? You have to buy insurance. That's part of the Obamacare law. You must have it or you will be penalized by the IRS. The insurance companies have to provide certain services. The hospitals, by law, especially in their emergency rooms, have to treat people. That's a law. You can't turn someone away who walks into an emergency room. So in order to balance all this, they go in and start hanking with all the prices. But see, now they don't have to deal with you, the common citizen. All they're doing is dealing with the insurance companies. So now it just becomes a boardroom exchange. Okay, you do this, I'll do that. If you do this, we'll provide that. Okay, when people come in, they're only going to get this much because that's all we can provide. And the insurance company's going, fine, that's fine. I don't really care. As long as we can make this financial exchange happen. Now, we're all talking about services for a patient that is seeing a doctor. And what part is the doctor or the patient playing in this negotiation of the boardroom? We're not there. There's no patient there. There's no doctor there. It is just two businesses negotiating prices. And who do you think is going to have to pay for that? You are, but not the way you're thinking of it. You're not going to pay in dollars. What you're going to pay in is the quality of the health care you receive. Firstly, you are being separated from your doctor because they can no longer provide the service you need for the price that they need to charge to do it. There have been so many doctors that have left their practices and have become employees of hospitals. Now, they're not free to act anymore the way they would typically choose to act. They're being given direction. Okay? They went from being entrepreneurs to being employees under a heavily run government agency. And you're just a pawn in this entire thing because your money is meaningless. You may have insurance, but that insurance has really no good incentive to serve you. They're going to serve the hospital because that's the boardroom conversation. Do you think they give a rat's behind about you, little old you? No, they don't. And they don't have to deal with you, the patient. And the hospital. They're just trying to keep their hospital running. This is just a conversation between the hospitals and the insurance companies. The distance between you and your doctor is about as wide as the Grand Canyon right now. Your doctor can't fight for you anymore. They can't even really serve you personally anymore. They serve their employer. And you know who that employer is now. You are no longer your doctor's employer by the means of the free market. This massive, confusing condition under which our American healthcare industry operates now is just well on its way to the paths of all socialist markets. And you can witness that failure on full display with the Alfie Evans story from Britain. This little baby had developed a brain condition that started to really deteriorate. And the hospitals in Britain tried to take care of him. And it was getting very difficult. And they had probably spent a lot of resources trying to help this baby. Britain operates under basically a socialized healthcare system. And this baby was in a hospital and was being cared for there. But the hospital decided that they had reached the ends of their means to help this baby. So the parents were looking to find another way or find another hospital or another treatment center to help their child. They're trying to save their child's life. But the hospital decided, that's the key word here, the hospital decided that they could no longer help this child under the guidelines of their socialized government healthcare system. They decided, we're done. We've spent enough money and we're not going to spend any more money. Now, the parents probably came to a point where they're like, okay, fine, we'll try something else. But what the hospital decided was that they were not going to be allowed to take their baby somewhere else for help. Not to another country, not to another hospital, nowhere. That baby was going to stay there, and the hospital had decided they were now going to flip the switch. No more ventilator, no more eating, nothing. They were not going to help this baby anymore, and they were going to allow this baby to die right there in the hospital. And the parents were desperate, and they reached out to the rest of the world, essentially. And the Pope stepped in from Italy and said, I will send a plane, we'll pick up the baby, we'll bring it to Italy, and we'll do everything we can to help this child because we value life. We, as the Catholic Church, value this life, and we want to help you. The hospital And the government in Britain said, no, you may not leave this hospital with your child. The government and the hospital made that decision. Under force, they kept that child in the hospital, turned off his breathing apparatus, and stopped feeding him, and let that child die in the hospital. That little baby breathed on its own for almost 56 hours, but he was denied treatment from that hospital. He was just supposed to sit there and starve to death in his parents' arms without any help. That has got to be one of the most gruesome stories to come out of a socialized healthcare system that I have ever heard. I mean, it was excruciating to have to watch these parents desperately reach out for help for their child, get the help, get the offer of help that they wanted, but not be able to use it. Literally, just were forced into a room where they watched their baby die. If you don't think that that could happen in the United States, you are sadly mistaken. Because when you allow your government to centralize all of the power and centralize all of the money, guess what? You end up with no power and no money to affect any change that you need to happen in your personal life. Okay, the administrative state. That's my take. I don't know how else to say it, but we have had 100 years of progressive ideology at various times dominating over our government, and this is the place we've arrived at. When you, the people, let go of the reins of government, don't be surprised when someone takes them and starts to control the horse. That's basically how you got to look at it. If you're not going to take the responsibility, be prepared for someone else to take that responsibility and to make decisions for you. Okay. Yep, I'm worn out. That was a long, long, long lecture, and I am done. And for a government class, we are almost done. I have 2 more lectures, and that's going to be the end of your government course. So we're almost at the end here. Hang in there. You're doing great. And we're going to be wrapping this up in 2 more lectures. Y'all have a great afternoon, and I will see you next time in government class at GW Bridge Academy.